In the winter of 1962, an invading Chinese force suffered exactly 14 casualties. Just 14 men killed and I think another 22 wounded across an entire theater of war.
Yeah, it's an astonishing statistic.
Right. And yet, with those incredibly light losses, they managed to completely displace massive, heavily fortified Indian defenses. I mean, they captured vast tracts of the Himalayas and triggered hundreds of Indian casualties.
And they didn't do it with overwhelming firepower. They basically let the mountains and really the psychology of their enemy do the killing for them.
Which is exactly what we're getting into today. Because when you look at the 1962 Sino-Indian War, history books usually obsess over the western sector in Ladakh or those famous brutal battles in the Kameng and Wolong areas out east.
Exactly. But right in the middle of all that sits this sprawling, almost silent puzzle, Central NEFA.
Right, the Northeast Frontier Agency, specifically the Subansiri and Shang Frontier Divisions. It's this massive area, and in most general accounts, it's treated almost like a blank spot on the map.
Yeah, they essentially tell you it remained dormant, like it was a quiet front.
But a quiet front does not mean an unimportant front, right? So the mission for this deep dive is to act as military historians and operational analysts. We're going through these records to answer one burning question.
Which is, why did a geographically difficult but highly defendable sector lose its operational advantage so spectacularly?
Because, as you'll see as we unpack this, a position really becomes untenable first in the mind, long before the enemy ever fires a shot.
Absolutely. And, to understand how a defense collapses without a major fight, we really have to look at the ground it's built on.
Right, the geography.
Yeah, because in Central NEFA, geography isn't just the setting, it's the primary combatant. We are looking at a deeply fractured expanse, about 300 to 350 kilometers wide.
Wow, that's huge.
And it plunges up to 150 kilometers deep into the mountains. The sheer verticality dictates everything. Altitudes range from 3,600 to an agonizing 5,500 meters.
Wait, 5,500 meters? The snow line permanently sits around 4,500 meters, doesn't it?
It does. So when we talk about troops operating here, we aren't just talking about walking up a steep hill. At 5,500 meters, your physiology begins to actively shut down.
Right, just digesting a meal requires more oxygen than the thin air can provide.
Exactly. And the mountain ranges crisscross in this way that creates deep, isolated gorges. If your unit is in one valley and your allied unit is just a few miles away in the next valley,
You might as well be on different planets.
basically, yeah, inter-valley movement is practically impossible. But the detail that really defines the entire operational reality is the roads, or, well, the lack of them.
Right, I saw this in the records. In 1962, on the Indian side of this massive sector, there was exactly one motorable road
Just one.
from a place called Majorbarri up to Along. Just one road for that entire expanse.
That single road is the choke point. Without a network of roads, you can't sustain a continuous front line. You can't drive trucks full of artillery shells or winter rations to the border.
So logistics absolutely dictates your operational freedom.
100%. Because the mountains prevent a continuous front, you end up with these isolated islands of troops.
And if you can't drive supplies to those islands, how do they even survive?
Through a really fragile lifeline, you're depending entirely on air maintenance dropping supplies at advanced landing grounds, or ALGs,
Right.
and human porters. You're relying on local porters to physically carry gear on their backs up these 5,000-meter peaks.
Which is insane. If a snowstorm grounds the transport planes, or if the porters just can't make the trek.
Those isolated islands of troops begin to starve. It's that simple.
Okay, so knowing all these geographical nightmares, how did India actually set up its forces?
Well, following some border skirmishes around 1959, specifically the Longju incident, India launched something called Operation Onkar.
Right, which was driven by a political directive known as the Forward Policy.
Exactly. The strategy was to push paramilitary forces, the Assam Rifles, as far forward as possible right up to the border, just to show the flag.
They established, 9 new posts in the Subansiri sector and 7 in Xiang?
Yeah.
I've always viewed this strategy like a wealthy homeowner putting up security cameras on the absolute furthest edges of this massive wooded estate. But they don't hire any actual guards to respond if someone breaks in.
That's a great way to put it.
They prioritized the mere presence of a claim over the actual defensibility of the position.
But it's actually worse than that. It's not just that they didn't have guards. Those cameras themselves were essentially glued to rotting trees.
Oh, man.
Their very presence drained resources because they had to be constantly kept alive via those precarious airdrops. An isolated post that can't be resupplied or reinforced is not a defensive position.
It's a tactical liability waiting to be exploited.
Exactly.
But, looking at the map, I found myself questioning the Chinese side of this equation. I mean, the terrain makes it impossible for India to move troops, sure. But the Chinese are looking at the exact same Himalayas.
Right.
Doesn't that terrain make an invasion equally impossible for them?
It does if you approach it with the same rigid mindset. But the Chinese approach this terrain problem from a completely different strategic angle.
How so?
Well, you have to look at their ultimate objective. For China, Subinsiri and Xi'an were purely secondary fronts. Their primary heavy offensive was happening way over to the west, in the Kameng Division.
So they never intended to conquer this entire central area.
None at all. Their aims were strictly limited. They just wanted to tie down maximum Indian forces so they couldn't be sent west, capture a few claim areas, and create a diversion.
Ah, okay. So because it was a secondary effort, they utilized a textbook execution of economy of force.
Exactly. And their force organization was totally counterintuitive.
Right, you'd expect them to deploy elite alpine troops for this impossible terrain.
But they did the exact opposite. They scraped together an ad hoc force of about 2,200 troops. That's just 3 battalions.
Wow.
And these weren't frontline shock troops. They were line of communication troops milked from rear guard supply areas like Lhasa and Shannan.
Wait, they used supply guards?
Yes. And the command structure was totally improvised, too. It was led by a political commissar named Tongguan-san, not a seasoned combat general.
That contrast is just staggering. You have India taking fully equipped regular infantry and scattering them across dozens of unsupportable forward posts to hold an imaginary line.
Yeah.
And then China uses a tiny, scraped-together force of supply guards, but gives them a laser-focused objective.
It really proves that a small force with a clear, localized aim will always outmaneuver a scattered force burdened by a muddled political mandate.
So they didn't need to defeat the whole Indian army, just apply pressure to the right spots.
Exactly. Let the isolation do the rest.
So let's track how that pressure was actually applied on the ground, starting with the Subinsiri sector. Just to give you a mental map, the Indian defensive depths here relied on a few key locations.
Right. Up near the border, you have forward posts like Asafala and Limeping. And further back down the valleys, you have Taliha and Daporijo.
Okay, so the operations unfolded in distinct phases. Phase I, around late October, the Chinese launched preliminary attacks against those extreme forward posts, like Asafala.
And the Indian troops stationed there, regular infantry from the Jammu and Kashmir Rifles, took the initial hit. They suffered casualties, over a dozen men killed or missing.
And almost immediately, the order came from the Indian Four Corps headquarters to withdraw all forward posts back to Taliha.
Which instantly ceded the operational initiative. By October 26th, the Chinese just walked into those forward areas and started improving the road networks on their side of the border.
Prepping for their next move.
Exactly. Now, the Indian command did attempt to reorganize. They designated this area as Sector 1 and tried to establish a cohesive brigade-level defense further back.
They ordered a massive logistical buildup, right? Dumping nearly a month's worth of supplies.
Which, on paper, pulling back to a defensible line and stockpiling is the textbook correct action.
But the friction of the mountains meant the timing was just fatally delayed.
Right. By the time they were actually trying to implement this defense, it was mid-November. And that's when the Chinese launched their main strike.
Which brings us to the operation around Limemaking. The sources give a really detailed case study of this, and it reveals so much about mountain warfare.
It really does. So the Chinese main attacking force heading for Limeping was about 650 men. But remember that impossible terrain?
Yeah.
It finally started working in India's favor. As the Indian troops withdrew previously, they destroyed a crucial suspension bridge at a place called Ryu.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, it took the Chinese advance 3 full days just to set up a temporary crossing over this freezing river gorge.
And then, on November 18th, they finally run into an Indian protective patrol led by a second lieutenant, M.R. Kishore.
And Kishore's patrol did exactly what they were trained to do. They engaged, there was a 45-minute firefight, the Chinese suffered casualties, and their advance bogged down.
So the terrain and the small unit tactics were actually functioning perfectly as a defensive multiplier. The Chinese momentum was totally stalled.
They were struggling. But, and here is where we have to look at the decision taken at the command level. Despite the enemy being severely delayed, Indian troops at the main stronghold of Limemaking were ordered to withdraw.
On the night of November 20th, they withdrew the night before the main Chinese attack even reached them.
Yep. The Chinese literally walked into Limemaking at 8:30 the next morning and took the entire position without firing a single shot.
That is just wild. And it wasn't an isolated incident, was it?
5 other Assam Rifles posts in the surrounding valleys withdrew without ever seeing a single Chinese soldier.
Why on earth do you abandon a fortified position when the mountain is doing the heavy lifting for you?
It points to a profound psychological collapse at the command level. The vital lesson here is that a terrain advantage is useless if it's not exploited by the commander's will to fight.
Right.
The high ground, the choke points, the supply dumps, none of it matters if the psychological dread of being cut off overrides tactical logic.
Because you have to put yourself in their shoes. You're staring at a 5,500-meter peak. The radio is spitting out reports of Chinese breakthroughs in other sectors.
Exactly. The fear of being surrounded in an unresupplyable pocket simply broke their nerve. When Army HQ found out about the withdrawal, they desperately tried to countermand the order, but the momentum of retreat had already taken over.
So, because the terrain dictated everything, the Chinese advance was faltering, which makes what happened next a profound psychological tragedy.
Right, and to fully grasp that, we need to shift our map east to the Xiang sector. If limicking was a baffling loss of nerve, Xiang shows us the lethal consequences of that panic.
The geography there is just as unforgiving.
Oh, yeah. The key locations you need to visualize are Manchukuo and Managong up north, Tooting and Jelling to the northeast, and the logistics hub of Along further south.
And survival here was exclusively tied to the advanced landing grounds.
Exactly, particularly at Along, Manchukuo, and Tooting.
So the Chinese plan for Chiang was pretty ambitious. They envisioned this grand pincer movement, swinging two arms around to trap the Indian defenders near Tooting and Jelling.
But here we see the limitations of the Chinese economy of force. Because they relied on that ad hoc rearguard group, they lack the capability to execute a complex pincer in this terrain.
Their planning was poor, coordination faltered, and the terrain just broke their timeline.
It proves that ambitious plans fail without the localized capability to execute them.
So the Chinese were actually stumbling, which makes the Manchukuo case study the absolute center of gravity for this entire deep dive.
Let's look at the actual deployment versus the real enemy threat. By mid-November, the Manchukuo subsector wasn't some tiny isolated outpost. It was heavily defended.
Right, you had over 800 regular Indian infantry troops, fully equipped, plus 6 additional platoons of Assam Rifles.
That is a highly formidable force for a constrained mountain valley. They had numbers, a fortified position, and an operational ALG right there for air support.
Okay, so what was the actual enemy threat approaching them around November 17th?
The Chinese force moving toward them was only about 2 companies in strength.
Wait, 2 companies against over 800 entrenched troops.
A mere fraction of the Indian defensive numbers. We have overwhelming numerical and positional superiority here.
But let's look at the decision process of the local brigade and battalion commanders. This is where the records become genuinely difficult to read.
Yeah, because without even consulting the general officer commanding of the 2nd Infantry Division, the guy actually in charge of the broader theater, these local commanders unilaterally deemed Manchukuo untenable.
On the night of November 18th, they ordered a total withdrawal of all 800-plus men.
The divisional headquarters actually intercepted the communications and sent a frantic signal pleading that Manchukuo must not be abandoned without a fight.
The math was completely in India's favor.
But the local commanders were no longer doing tactical math, they were doing psychological math.
The isolation, the rumors of defeat elsewhere, the sheer hostility of the environment, it convinced them they were already defeated.
It's like a deep-sea diver operating in pitch-black water. Their flashlight flickers for a second and panic sets in. In their terror, they cut their own air hose so they can swim to the surface faster.
Wow, yeah. The environment was the actual threat, but the panic is what made it lethal. The withdrawal from Manchukuo became a literal death march.
They abandoned a fortified valley with an airstrip to retreat down a rugged, virtually impassable hunter's track toward a place called Tato.
And the commanding officer of one of the battalions, Lieutenant Colonel D.A. Taylor, literally died of exhaustion trying to navigate that terrain.
The environment simply broke him.
And because they were strung out in a chaotic, panicked retreat, the main party was easily ambushed on November 20th. They suffered dozens of casualties in a single firefight.
Out of the roughly 840 men who started that retreat, over 150 ended up dead, missing in the freezing mountains, or taken as POWs.
It is just the most profound lesson we can extract from this theater. The exhaustion and the self-inflicted chaos of a panicked withdrawal proved vastly more deadly than the enemy's actual combat capability.
The Chinese didn't defeat the Indian forces at Manchukuo. The Indian command defeated itself.
Let's go back to that staggering statistic from the beginning. During this entire second phase of operations, across this massive, brutal theater, the Chinese suffered only 14 killed and 22 wounded.
14 killed
That's
against thousands of entrenched defenders.
They captured vast tracts of territory simply by showing up, applying localized pressure, and letting the mountains and the command's psychological fragility do the rest.
If we synthesize this by comparing Central NEFA to the more famous battles of the 62 War, like Namkachu or Selah, a very clear tragic pattern emerges.
Right.
The failure was rarely at the level of the individual soldier.
And the sources make that very clear. Small units, like Lieutenant Kishore's patrol at Lime King, when given a clear objective to hold a line, they fought bravely. They inflicted casualties.
The overarching collapse was strictly the result of command uncertainty and withdrawal confusion.
So if we pull all the evidence together, a few irrefutable laws of mountain warfare emerge here. First, terrain dictates logistics, and logistics dictates reality. You don't have sweeping front lines. You have isolated islands.
Second, operations in this environment require a ruthless economy of force. A small, focused element will always shatter a large, scattered one.
Third, political directives like the forward policy, which prioritize planting a flag over a defensible supply line, inevitably create a fragile, defeatist mindset.
And fourth, the ultimate law. Command confidence is the absolute center of gravity. If a commander loses their nerve, the terrain stops being a fortress and instantly becomes a tomb.
Geography is only a multiplier if you possess the logistics to sustain your presence and the psychological iron to stand your ground.
Exactly. Central NEFA wasn't a quiet front because nothing happened. It was quiet because the primary battles were fought internally within the command structure. The mountains just silently absorbed the cost.
You simply cannot understand the full scope of the 1962 conflict without analyzing the psychological collapse in these valleys.
It fundamentally changes how you view military history.
It really does. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Today, modern militaries rely on this incredible web of technology.
Sure.
We have surveillance drones feeding live video, satellite imagery mapping every inch of terrain, GPS tracking, secure comms. We operate under the illusion that we have eyes everywhere and absolute control.
Right.
But looking at what happened in the deep, freezing isolation of Machuca, you have to ask yourself, if a modern commander is cut off by a blinding snowstorm or a cyber-jamming attack in a 5,500-meter mountain pass, and the radio goes silent.
Does all that high-tech equipment even matter?
Exactly. Or, stripped of their digital lifelines, would the psychological ghosts of 1962 just repeat themselves? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.